The Crystal Cave by Mary Stewart, Book 3, The Wolf. 1. I was 5 years with Ambrosius in Brittany. Looking back now, I see much of what happened has been changed in my memory, like a smashed mosaic, which is mended in later years by a man who has almost forgotten the first picture. Certain things come to me plain in all their colors and details. Others, perhaps more important, come hazy, as if the picture had been dusted over by what has happened since: death, sorrow, changes of the heart. Places I always remember well, some of them so clearly that I feel even now as if I could walk into them, and that if I had the strength to concentrate and the power that once fitted me like my robe, I might even now rebuild them here in the dark, as I rebuilt the Giant's Dance for Ambrosius all those years ago. Places are clear, and ideas, which came to me so new and shining then, but not always the people. Sometimes, now as I search my memory, I wonder if here and there I have confused them one with another. Delasius with Gallipus, Cadel with Cedric, the Breton officer whose name I forget now, with my grandfather's captain in Maridunum, who once tried to make me into the kind of swordsman that he thought even a bastard prince should want to be. But as I write of Ambrosius, it is as if he were here with me now, lit against this darkness, as the man with the cap was lit on that first frost-enchanted night in Brittany. Even without my robe of power, I can conjure up against the darkness his eyes, steady under frowning brows, the heavy lines of his body, the face, which seems so young to me now, engraved into hardness by the devouring, goading will that kept his eyes turned westward to his closed kingdom for the 20-odd years it took him to grow from child to comes and build against all odds of poverty and weakness the striking force that grew with him, waiting for the time. It is harder to write of Uther, or rather it is hard to write of Uther, as if he were in the past, part of a story that has been over these many years. Even more vividly than Ambrosius, he is here with me, not here in the darkness. It is the part of me that was Merthin that is here in the darkness. The part that was Uther is out there in the sunlight, keeping the coast of Britain whole, following the design I made for him, the design that Gallipus showed to me on a summer's day in Wales. But there, of course, it is no longer Uther of whom I write. It is the man who was the sum of us, who was all of us, Ambrosius, who made me, Uther, who worked with me, myself, who used him, as I used every man who came to my hand, to make Arthur for Britain. From time to time news came from Britain, and occasionally with it, through Gorlois of Cornwall, news of my home. It seemed that after my grandfather's death, Camlac had not immediately deserted the old alliance with his kinsman Vortigern. He had to feel himself more secure before he would dare break away to support the young man's party, as Vortimer's faction was called. Indeed, Vortimer himself had stopped short of open rebellion, but it seemed clear that this must come eventually. King Vortigern was back between the landslide and the flood. If he was to stay king of the British, he must call on his Saxon wife's countrymen for help, and the Saxon mercenaries year by year increased their demands till the country was split and bleeding under what men openly called the Saxon Terror. And, in the West especially, where men were still free, rebellion only waited for a leader of leaders, and so desperate was Vortigern's situation becoming that he was forced, against his better judgment, to entrust his armed forces in the West more and more to Vortimer and his brothers, whose blood at least carried none of the Saxon taint. Of my mother there was no news, except that she was safe in St. Peter's. Ambrosius sent her no message. If it came to her ears that a certain Malinius Ambrosius was in the was with the Count of Brittany, she would know what to think, but a letter or message direct from the king's enemy would endanger her unnecessarily. She would know, said Ambrosius, soon enough. In fact, it was 5 years before the break came, but the time went by like a tide race. With the possibility of an opening developing in Wales and Cornwall, Ambrosius's preparations were accelerated. If the men of the West wanted a leader, he had every intention that it should be not Vortimer, but himself. He would bide his time and let Vortimer be the wedge, but he and Uther would be the hammer that drove after it into the crack. Meanwhile, hope in less Britain ran high. Offers of troops and alliances poured in. The countryside shook to the tramp of horses and marching feet, and the streets of the engineers and armourers rang far into the night as men redoubled their efforts to make 2 weapons in the time before it had taken to make 1. Now at last the break was coming, and when it came Ambrosius must be ready, and with no chance of failure. One does not wait half a lifetime gathering the material to make a killing spear, and then lose it at random in the dark. Not only men and materials, but time and spirit, and the very wind of heaven must be right for him, and the gods themselves must open the gate. And for this, he said, they had sent me to him. It was my coming, just at such a time, with words of victory and full of the vision of the unconquered God, which persuaded him, and even more important the soldiers with him, that the time was at last approaching, when he could strike with the certainty of victory. So I found my fear. He rated me. Be sure, I had never asked him again how he intended to use me. He made it clear enough, and between pride and fear and longing, I fought to learn all that I could be taught, and to open myself for the power which was all I could give him. If he wanted a prophet ready to hand, he must have been disappointed. I saw nothing of importance during this time. Knowledge, I suppose, blocked the gates of vision, but this was the time for knowledge. I studied with Belasius till I outran him, learning as he had never done how to apply the calculations which to him were as much an art as songs were to me. Even songs, indeed, I was to use. I spent long hours in the street of the engineers, and had frequently to be dragged by a grumbling cadle from some oily piece of practical work which unfitted me, as he said, for any company but a bath slave's. I wrote down, too, all I could remember of Gallipus's medical teaching, and added practical experience by helping the army doctors whenever I could. I had the freedom of the camp and the town, and with Ambrosius's name to back me, I took to this freedom like a hungry young wolf in his first full meal. I learned all the time from every man or woman I met. I looked, as I had promised, in the light and the dark, at the sunshine and at the stale pool. I went with Ambrosius to the shrine of Mithras below the farmstead, and with Belasius to the gathering in the forest. I was even allowed to sit silently at meetings between the Count and his captains, though nobody pretended that I would ever be much use in the field. Unless, said Uther once, half amused and half malicious, he is to stand above us, like Joshua holding the sun back, and give us more time to do the real work. Though joking apart, he might do worse. The men seem to think him as something halfway between a courtier of Mithras and a splinter of the true cross. Saving your presence, brother, I'm damned certain he'd be more stuck up and on a hill, like a lucky charm where they can see him, than down in the field where he wouldn't last 5 minutes. He had even more to say when, at the age of 16, I gave up the daily sword practice, which gave a man the minimum training of self-defense. But my father merely laughed and said nothing. I think he knew, though as yet I did not, that I had my own kind of protection. So I learned from everyone. The old women who gathered plants and cobwebs and seaweeds for healing, the travelling peddlers and quack healers, the horse doctors, the soothsayers, the priests. I listened to the soldiers' talk outside the taverns, and the officers' talk in my father's house, and the boys' talk in the streets. But there was one thing about which I learned nothing. By the time I left Brittany at 17, I was still ignorant of women. When I thought about them, which happened often enough, I told myself that I had no time, that there was a lifetime still ahead of me for such things, and that now I had work to do which mattered more. But I suppose the plain truth is that I was afraid of them, so I lost my desires in work, and indeed I believe now that the fear came from the god. So I waited and minded my own business, which, as I saw it then, was to fit myself to serve my father. One day I was in Tremorinus's workshop. Tremorinus, the master engineer, was a pleasant man who allowed me to learn all I could from him, gave me space in the workshops and material to experiment with. This particular day I remember how, when he came into the workshop and saw me busy over a model at my corner bench, he came over to have a look at it. When he saw what I was doing, he laughed. "I'd have thought there were plenty of those around without troubling to put up any more." I was interested in how they got them there. I tilted the scale model of the standing stone back into place. He looked surprised. I knew why. He had lived in Les Britain all his life, and the landscape there is so seamed with stones that men do not see them any more. One walks daily through a forest of stone, and to most men it seems dead stone, but not to me. To me they still said something, and I had to find out what. But I did not tell Tremorinus this. I added merely, "I was trying to work it out to scale." "I can tell you something straight away that's been tried and it doesn't work," he said, looking at the pulley I had rigged to lift the model. "That might do for uprights, but only the lighter ones, and it doesn't work at all for the capstones." "No, I'd found that out, but I had an idea. I was going to tackle it another way." "You're wasting your time. Let's see you getting down to something practical, something we need and can use. Now, that idea of yours for a light mobile crane might be worth developing." A few minutes later he was called away. I dismantled the model and sat down to my new calculations. I had not told Tremorinus about them. He had more important things to think about, and in any case he would have laughed if I had told him I had learned from a poet how to lift the standing stones. It had happened this way. One day, about a week before this, as I walked by the water that guarded the town walls, I heard a man singing. The voice was old and wavering and hoarse with overuse, the voice of a professional singer who had strained it above the noise of the crowd. And through singing, with the winter cold in his throat, what caught my attention was neither the voice nor the tune, which could hardly be picked out, but the sound of my own name. "Merlin, Merlin, where art thou going?" He was sitting by the bridge, with a bowl for begging. I saw that he was blind, but the remnant of his voice was true, and he made no gesture with his bowl as he heard me stop near him, but sat as one sits at a harp, head bent, listening to what the strings say, with fingers stirring as if they felt the notes. He had sung, I would judge, in kings' halls. "Merlin, Merlin, where art thou going, so early in the day with thy black dog? I have been searching for the egg, the red egg of the sea serpent, which lies by the shore in the hollow stone. And I go to gather cresses in the meadow, the green cress and the golden grasses, the golden moss that gives sleep, and the mistletoe high in the oak, the druid's bough that grows deep in the woods by the running water. Merlin, Merlin, come back from the wood and to the fountain. Leave the oak and the golden grasses, leave the cress in the water meadow, and the red egg of the sea serpent in the foam by the hollow stone. Merlin, Merlin, leave thy seeking, there is no diviner but God." Nowadays this song is well known as the one of Mary the Maiden, or the King and the Grey Seal. But it was the first time I had heard it When he knew who it was who had stopped to listen, he seemed pleased that I should sit beside him on the bank and ask questions. I remember that on that first morning we talked mostly of the song, then of himself. I found he had been a young man on Mona, the Druid's Isle, and knew Caernarvon, and had walked on Snowdon. It was in the Druid's Isle that he had lost his sight. He never told me how, but when I told him that the seaweeds and cresses that I hunted along the shore were only plants for healing, not for magic, he smiled and sang a verse I had heard my mother sing, which, he said, would be a shield, against what he did not say, nor did I ask him. I put money into his bowl, which he accepted with dignity, but when I promised to find a harp for him, he went silent, staring with those empty eye sockets, and I could see he did not believe me. I brought the harp next day. My father was generous, and I had no need to ever tell him what the money was for. When I put the harp into the old singer's hands, he wept, then took my hands and kissed them. After that, right up to the time I left Les Britain, I often sought him out. He had travelled wildly in lands as far apart as Ireland and Africa. He taught me songs from every country, Italy and Gaul and the White North, and older songs from the East, strange wandering tunes that had come westward, he said, from the islands of the East, with the men of old, who had raised the standing stones, and they spoke of laws long forgotten except in song. I do not think he himself thought of them as anything but songs of old magic, poets' tales, but the more I thought about them, the more clearly they spoke to me of men who had rarely lived, and work they had rarely done. And they raised the great stones to mark the sun and moon and build for their gods and the giant kings of old. I said something once about this to Tremorinus, who was kindly as well as clever, and who usually managed to find time for me, but he laughed and put it aside, and I said no more. Ambrosius's technicians had more than enough to think about in those days, without helping a boy to work out a set of calculations of no practical use in the coming invasion, so I let it be. It was in the spring of my 18th year that the news finally came from Britain. Through January and February, winter had closed the seaways, and it was not till early March, taking advantage of the cold, still weather, before the gales began, that a small trading boat put into port, and Ambrosius got news. Stirring as it was, literally so, for within a few hours of its coming, the Count's messengers were riding north and east to gather his allies at last, and quickly, for the news was late. It appeared that Vortimer had finally, some time before, broken with his father and the Saxon queen. Tired of petitioning the High King to break with his Saxon allies and protect his own people from them, several of the British leaders, among them the men of the West, had persuaded Vortimer to take matters into his own hands at last, and had risen with him. They had declared him king, and rallied to his banner against the Saxons, whom they had succeeded in driving back south and eastward, till they took refuge with their longships in the Isle of Thanet. Even there Vortimer pursued them, and through the last days of autumn and the beginning of winter had beleaguered them there, until they pleaded only to be allowed to depart in peace, packed up their goods, and went back to Germany, leaving their women and children behind them. But Vortimer's vicious kingship did not last long. It was not clear exactly what had happened, but the rumour was that he had died of poison treacherously administered by a familiar of the Queen. Whatever the truth of the matter, he was dead, and Vortigern, his father, was once more in command. Almost his first act had been, and against the blame was imputed to his wife, to send yet again for Hengist and his Saxons to return to Britain. With a small force, he had said, nothing but a mobile peacekeeping force to help him impose order and pull together his divided kingdom. In fact, the Saxons had promised 300,000 men, so rumour said, and though it was to be supposed that rumour lied, it was certain, at any rate, that Hengist planned to come with a considerable force. There was also a fragment of news from Maridunum The messenger was no spy of Ambrosius. The news we got was, as it were, only the larger rumours. These were bad enough. It seemed that my uncle Camlac, together with all his nobles, my grandfather's men, the men that I knew, had risen with Vortimer, and fought beside him in the 4 pitched battles against the Saxons. In the second, at Epis Ford, Camlac had been killed, along with Vortimer's brother, Catigern. What concerned me more was that after Vortimer's death, reprisals had been levelled at the men who had fought with him. Vortigern had annexed Camlac's kingdom to join his own lands of Gwent, and, wanting hostages, had repeated his action of 25 years earlier. He had taken Camlac's children, one of them still an infant, lodged them in the care of Queen Rowena, who had no means of knowing if they were still alive, nor did we know if Olwen's son, who had met the same fate, had survived. It seemed unlikely. Of my mother there was no news. 2 days after the news came, the spring gales began, and once more the seas were locked against us and against news. But this hardly mattered. Indeed, it worked both ways. If we could get no news from Britain, they could have none of us, and of the final accelerated preparations for the invasion of Western Britain, for it was certain that the time had now come. It was not only a case of marching to the relief of Wales and Cornwall, but if there were to be any men left to rally the Red Dragon would have to fight for his crown this coming year. "You'll go back with the first boat," said Ambrosius to me. But without looking up from the map, which was spread on the table in front of him, I was standing over by the window. Even with the shutters closed and the curtains drawn, I could hear the wind, and beside me the curtains stirred in a draught, and I said, "Yes, sir," and crossed to the table. Then I saw his fingers pointing on the map. "I'm to go to Moridunum?" He nodded. "You'll take the first westbound boat and make your way home. From wherever it docks, you are to go straight up to Gallipus and get what news there is from him. I doubt if you would be recognized in the town, but take no risks. Gallipus is safe. You can make him your base." "There was no word from Cornwall, then?" "Nothing except a rumor that Gorlois was with Vortigern." "With Vortigern?" I digested this for a moment. "Then he did not rise with Vortimer?" "As far as my information goes, no." "He's trimming, then?" "Perhaps. I find it hard to believe. It may mean nothing. I understand that he has married a young wife, and it may be only that he kept within walls all winter to keep her warm, or that he foresaw what would happen to Vortimer, and preferred to serve my cause by staying safe and apparently loyal to the High King. But until I know, I cannot send to him directly. He may be watched, so you are to go to Gallipus for the news from Wales. I'm told Vortigern's holed up there somewhere, while the length of eastern Britain lies open to Hengist. I'll have to smoke the old wolf out first, then wield the west against the Saxons, but it will have to be fast, and I want Caerleon." He looked up then. "I'm sending your old friend with you, Merrick. You can send word back by him. Let's hope you find all well. You want news yourself, I dare say." "It can wait," I said. He said nothing to that, but raised his brows at me, and then turned back to the map. "Well, sit down and I'll brief you myself. Let's hope you can get away soon." I indicated the swaying curtains. "I shall be sick all the way." He looked up from his map and laughed. "By Mithras, I hadn't thought of that. Do you suppose I shall be too? A damned undignified way to go back to one's home." "To one's kingdom," I said. And that is the end of chapter 1.